Climate change and gender mainstreaming. Course content. Introduction to climate change and gender. Understanding gender mainstreaming. Climate vulnerability through a gender lens. Policy frameworks and international agreements. Gendered impacts of climate change. Gender-responsive climate action. Women leading climate solutions. Climate finance and gender equality. Tools and methodologies for gender integration in climate planning. Toward a gender-just climate future. Part 1. Introduction to climate change and gender. Understanding climate change. Climate change refers to the long-term alteration of temperature and typical weather patterns in a place. It is primarily driven by human activities, notably the burning of fossil fuels, deforestation, industrial processes, and unsustainable land use practices. These activities release greenhouse gases, GHGs, into the atmosphere, enhancing the natural greenhouse effect and leading to global warming. The consequences of climate change are far-reaching, including rising sea levels, more intense and frequent extreme weather events, shifting agricultural patterns, loss of biodiversity, and disruptions to freshwater systems. These impacts threaten not only environmental stability, but also social and economic structures, particularly in vulnerable communities. Gender and its social dimensions. Gender refers to the socially constructed roles, responsibilities, behaviors, and expectations assigned to individuals based on their sex. These roles differ from one society to another and are influenced by cultural, religious, historical, and economic factors. While sex is a biological classification, gender is a fluid and evolving social concept. In the context of climate change, gender plays a significant role in shaping people's experiences, vulnerabilities, and capacities. Women and men often face different risks and opportunities due to their distinct roles in families and communities, access to resources, and participation in decision-making processes. The nexus between climate change and gender. Climate change does not affect all people equally. Its impacts are deeply intertwined with existing social inequalities, including gender disparities. Women, particularly in developing countries, are often more vulnerable to climate-related risks due to limited access to resources such as land, credit, education, and technology. Despite their vulnerability, women are not merely passive victims of climate change. They possess unique knowledge, skills, and experiences that are vital for climate adaptation and mitigation. However, these contributions often go unrecognized and underutilized due to systemic gender biases and a lack of inclusive policies. The case for gender mainstreaming in climate policy. Gender mainstreaming is the process of assessing the implications of any planned action, legislation, policies, or programs for individuals of different genders. It aims to make gender equality a central part of all policy development, implementation, and evaluation. In the realm of climate change, gender mainstreaming ensures that both women's and men's needs, knowledge, and contributions are considered. This approach not only promotes equity, but also enhances the effectiveness and sustainability of climate interventions. When gender considerations are integrated into climate policies and actions, outcomes are more inclusive, just, and resilient. Purpose and structure of this course. This course explores the critical intersection of climate change and gender, highlighting the importance of gender mainstreaming in climate policy and practice. It draws upon global frameworks, national case studies, and grassroots initiatives to showcase both the challenges and the opportunities in achieving gender-inclusive climate action. In the parts that follow, we will delve deeper into the specific gendered impacts of climate change, analyze international policy responses, examine case studies, and propose practical strategies for mainstreaming gender in climate planning and implementation. Part 2. Understanding gender mainstreaming. Defining gender mainstreaming. Gender mainstreaming is a strategy for achieving gender equality by assessing the implications for individuals of different genders in any planned action, including legislation, policies, or programs. The concept was formalized in 1995 at the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, and has since become a cornerstone of international development and policy planning. At its core, gender mainstreaming involves integrating gender perspectives and considerations into every stage of the policy cycle: planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. It requires institutions and decision-makers to systematically evaluate how decisions will affect women, men, and gender-diverse individuals, and to adjust those decisions accordingly to promote equity and inclusion. Key principles of gender mainstreaming: equality and non-discrimination. Gender mainstreaming seeks to eliminate inequalities and ensure equal rights and opportunities for all genders. Participation and empowerment. It emphasizes the active involvement of women and marginalized genders in decision-making processes. Intersectionality recognizes that gender interacts with other social categories such as race, class, age, and ability, creating multiple dimensions of disadvantage or privilege. Accountability and transparency. Institutions must be held responsible for the gendered impacts of their policies and programs. Transformative change. Beyond equal representation, gender mainstreaming aims to challenge and change structural inequalities and power relations. Gender mainstreaming in development context. In development, gender mainstreaming has been employed to ensure that women benefit equally from initiatives in areas such as education, health, agriculture, and governance. It has led to targeted interventions, like girls' education programs or women's microfinance schemes, but more importantly, it has influenced the way policies are designed and evaluated. However, implementation has not always been consistent or effective. In many cases, gender mainstreaming is treated as a box-ticking exercise, lacking real commitment or resourcing. A genuine gender mainstreaming approach requires institutional change, capacity building, and continuous monitoring and learning. The relevance of gender mainstreaming in climate policy. Climate change intersects with gender inequalities in profound ways. Women, particularly those in low-income, rural, or indigenous communities, are more likely to experience the adverse effects of climate change due to their reliance on natural resources, limited access to information and services, and underrepresentation in decision-making. Gender mainstreaming in climate policy ensures that women's voices and perspectives shape climate strategies. Climate actions do not exacerbate existing inequalities. Gender-specific needs are addressed in adaptation and mitigation measures. Women's knowledge and leadership are recognized and supported. By embedding gender considerations into climate policy, governments and organizations can develop more effective, equitable, and sustainable responses to the climate crisis. Tools and approaches for gender mainstreaming. There are several practical tools and approaches used to mainstream gender in policy and project design. Gender analysis, a systematic approach to understanding gender roles, relations, and inequalities in a given context. Gender budgeting, evaluating public budgets to ensure that resources are allocated in ways that promote gender equality. Gender-responsive indicators, metrics that track progress on gender outcomes in programs and policies. Capacity building, training and supporting institutions to develop gender competencies and leadership. Each of these tools contributes to creating a more inclusive framework that acknowledges and acts upon gender-specific realities. Challenges in gender mainstreaming. Despite widespread acknowledgement of its importance, gender mainstreaming faces several challenges. Lack of political will. Without strong leadership, gender considerations may be sidelined. Insufficient data. A lack of gender disaggregated data hampers effective planning and monitoring. Institutional resistance. Entrenched norms and practices can limit gender-sensitive approaches. Resource constraints. gender initiatives often lack the funding and staffing needed for meaningful implementation. Overcoming these challenges requires sustained advocacy, institutional reform, and inclusive dialogue. Conclusion: gender mainstreaming is not an end in itself, but a means to achieve gender equality in all spheres of life. When applied to climate change, it ensures that no one is left behind in the transition to a more sustainable and resilient world. By understanding the principles, tools, and challenges of gender mainstreaming, we lay the groundwork for more just and effective climate action in the parts ahead. Part 3: Climate Vulnerability Through a Gender Lens. Defining climate vulnerability. Climate vulnerability refers to the degree to which a system, community, or individual is susceptible to and unable to cope with the adverse effects of climate change. It is influenced by three key factors. Exposure, the extent to which one is in contact with climate hazards, e.g. floods, droughts, storms. Sensitivity, the degree to which one is affected by those hazards. Adaptive capacity, the ability to respond, recover, and adjust to climate-related impacts. Understanding vulnerability requires looking beyond environmental conditions to include social, economic, and political dimensions that shape people's resilience or fragility. Gender and vulnerability, the uneven burden. Gender plays a critical role in determining vulnerability to climate change. Across many parts of the world, women and girls often face systemic barriers that increase their sensitivity to climate impacts and limit their adaptive capacity. These barriers include limited access to resources, land, credit, technology, lower levels of education and literacy, restricted mobility and decision-making power, unequal caregiving responsibilities. These gender disadvantages mean that when climate disasters strike, women, especially those in poor and marginalized communities, are often hit the hardest. Case studies: gendered vulnerabilities in practice. South Asia, women and flood displacement. In flood-prone areas like Bangladesh and India, women are often disproportionately affected. Cultural norms may restrict their mobility or limit their access to early warning systems. In evacuation centers, women may face overcrowding, lack of privacy, and increased risk of gender-based violence. Sub-Saharan Africa, drought and agricultural livelihoods. Women in sub-Saharan Africa contribute significantly to agriculture, but often lack ownership of land and access to irrigation or drought-resistant seeds. When droughts reduce crop yields, women's food security, income, and family nutrition responsibilities are severely impacted. Latin America, indigenous women and forests. Indigenous women play key roles in managing biodiversity, especially in forest communities. Climate change-driven deforestation and displacement undermine their livelihoods and cultural identities. Moreover, their exclusion from formal land and policy rights further compounds their vulnerability. Intersectionality, compounding inequalities. Gender does not act alone in shaping climate vulnerability. Factors such as age, race, disability, geographic location, and socioeconomic status intersect to create complex layers of disadvantage. For example, elderly women may have limited mobility during extreme weather events. Girls in disaster zones may face increased school dropouts or early marriage. Women with disabilities may be excluded from relief planning and support services. Recognizing these intersections is essential for designing effective and inclusive climate responses. Women's roles in building resilience. Despite their heightened vulnerability, women are not merely victims of climate change, they are also powerful agents of resilience and adaptation. Across the globe, women have demonstrated leadership in community organizing for disaster preparedness, sustainable agricultural practices, water and natural resource management, innovative grassroots solutions to climate risks. By recognizing and investing in these contributions, communities can strengthen their adaptive capacity and sustainability. The importance of gender-sensitive risk assessments. To address gendered vulnerabilities effectively, climate risk assessments must include a gender perspective. This involves collecting gender disaggregated data, including women in vulnerability mapping and planning, designing early warning systems and evacuation plans that address diverse needs, creating gender-specific indicators for monitoring impacts. Such measures ensure that responses are equitable, relevant, and effective across different population groups. Conclusion: climate change is not gender neutral. Its impacts are filtered through existing inequalities that shape how different individuals and communities experience and respond to environmental change. Understanding climate vulnerability through a gender lens is critical for creating solutions that are not only environmentally sustainable, but also socially just. As we proceed, we will explore how international and national policies can integrate these insights to promote gender-responsive climate action. Part 4: Policy Frameworks and International Agreements. Introduction. Global efforts to tackle climate change have evolved over the decades through a series of international agreements, frameworks, and policies. Increasingly, these frameworks recognize the importance of gender equality and the role of women in climate action. This part explores the key international agreements that guide climate and gender policy, the progress made so far, and the gaps that remain. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. The UNFCCC, established in 1992, is the primary international treaty addressing climate change. While early documents made little reference to gender, the role of women gained recognition in later developments. The Lima Work Programme on Gender, 2014, marked a turning point by formally recognizing gender equality and women's empowerment as critical to effective climate policy. Encouraged the participation of women in UNFCCC processes and the integration of gender into climate actions. The Gender Action Plan GAP, adopted in 2017 at COP23 in Bonn, aims to advance gender-responsive climate policy and promote women's leadership. Key focus areas include capacity building, gender balance, coherence across frameworks, gender-responsive implementation and monitoring. COP26 and COP27 developments. COP26 Glasgow and COP27 Sharm el-Sheikh reinforced gender commitments. Emphasis on financing for gender-responsive climate initiatives. Calls for integration of gender in national climate policies and action plans. The Paris Agreement, 2015. The Paris Agreement represents a landmark accord that brought all nations into a common cause to combat climate change. It explicitly includes gender equality and women's empowerment in its preamble. Article 7 also highlights the need for gender-responsive adaptation action. Key implications. Encourages countries to include gender considerations in their nationally determined contributions, NDCs. Recognizes the role of women in enhancing climate resilience and sustainability. Supports gender-sensitive capacity building and technology transfer. The Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. The SDGs, adopted in 2015 as part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, provide a comprehensive framework linking climate action and gender equality. Goal 5. Gender equality aims to end all forms of discrimination against women and girls. Goal 13. Climate action calls for urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. The interlinkages between 5 Sudanese pounds and 13 Sudanese pounds emphasize that climate solutions must be inclusive and equitable to be effective. Other relevant international instruments. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. Though not climate-specific, CEDAW provides a strong legal foundation for women's rights, which can be extended to climate justice. General Recommendation No. 37, 2018, addresses gendered impacts of climate change and disasters. Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015-2030 highlights the role of women in disaster risk reduction. Calls for inclusive decision-making and access to information for all genders. National policies and gender integration. Many countries have begun to integrate gender into their climate strategies, particularly through nationally determined contributions (NDCs). Some nations include gender-specific targets or commitments. National adaptation plans (NAPs). These plans often involve gender assessments and participatory processes. Gender and Climate Change Action Plans (GCCAPs), country-specific strategies to mainstream gender in climate actions. Examples: Kenya developed a comprehensive gender and climate change strategy. Peru has gender indicators in its NDC. Bangladesh prioritizes women's involvement in climate adaptation programs. Gaps and challenges in policy implementation. Despite growing recognition, several challenges persist. Lack of enforcement mechanisms for gender commitments. Inadequate funding for gender-responsive actions. Insufficient data and gender analysis in climate planning. Low representation of women in climate negotiation and decision-making bodies. Fragmentation between gender and climate ministries or departments. Moving forward, strengthening policy integration. To strengthen gender mainstreaming in climate frameworks. Countries should embed gender equality in climate legislation and budgeting. Capacity building and training for policymakers and institutions is essential. Gender disaggregated data collection must be prioritized. Financing mechanisms should be gender responsive, targeting women-led initiatives and vulnerable communities. Collaboration between civil society, government, and international organizations must be encouraged. Conclusion: international and national frameworks increasingly recognize the importance of gender-responsive climate action. However, meaningful integration requires more than rhetoric. It demands implementation, accountability, and investment. As the climate crisis accelerates, so too must efforts to ensure that policies are inclusive, just, and gender-aware. The next part will explore how climate change impacts manifest differently across genders, and why a gendered lens is essential in impact assessments. Part 5: Gendered Impacts of Climate Change. Introduction. Climate change affects everyone, but not equally. Gender roles, responsibilities, and access to resources significantly shape how individuals and communities experience and respond to climate-related impacts. This part explores how climate change affects women, men, and gender-diverse individuals in different ways, focusing on the disproportionate burdens faced by women and the compounding effects of inequality. Health impacts. Climate change exacerbates health risks through increased heat waves, disease outbreaks, food and water insecurity, and extreme weather events. Women, particularly pregnant women, face heightened risks during heat stress, vector-borne disease outbreaks, e.g., malaria, dengue, and in the aftermath of disasters where reproductive and maternal health services are disrupted. Men may experience higher occupational exposure to extreme weather in sectors like agriculture, construction, or fishing, but often have more access to healthcare and mobility. Gender-diverse individuals may avoid seeking healthcare in emergencies due to discrimination or lack of gender-affirming services. Livelihoods and economic security. Climate change impacts economic activities differently for men and women, due to their roles in the labor force and unequal access to economic assets. Women in rural areas often work in agriculture, which is highly climate sensitive. They are less likely to own land, access credit, or use technology, making it harder to adapt to changing conditions. Urban women employed in informal sectors, e.g., street vending, domestic work, may lose income during climate-related disruptions with limited safety nets. Men working in fishing, mining, or other natural resource-based industries may also face livelihood loss but are more likely to receive institutional support or retraining opportunities. Food security and nutrition. Women are typically responsible for household food preparation and childcare, making them more vulnerable when climate change affects food availability, prices, and quality. Droughts and floods reduce crop yields and disrupt food systems, leading to nutritional deficiencies, especially for women and children. In many cultures, women eat last and least, increasing their risk of malnutrition during food scarcity. Loss of traditional crops and farming knowledge also affects women's food sovereignty and cultural roles. Water and energy access. Changes in water availability due to climate change disproportionately affect women, who are often tasked with water collection and fuelwood gathering in rural communities. Women and girls may travel long distances to fetch water, increasing their exposure to physical harm, fatigue, and gender-based violence. Lack of access to clean energy sources, e.g., for cooking or heating, exposes women to indoor air pollution, contributing to respiratory illnesses. Time spent on these unpaid tasks reduces opportunities for education, income-generating work, or community engagement. Displacement and migration. Climate-induced displacement and migration have gendered dynamics. Women displaced by disasters often experience limited access to shelter, sanitation, legal aid, and protection services. Displacement camps can be unsafe for women and girls due to overcrowding, lack of privacy, and heightened risk of sexual and gender-based violence (SGBV). Men may migrate for work, leaving women behind with increased caregiving and financial burdens. Gender-based violence (GBV). Climate stressor can exacerbate existing gender-based violence and create new risks. Disasters and resource scarcity often intensify domestic violence, child marriage, and exploitation. Women in disaster zones or displacement settings may be coerced into sex-for-aid situations or forced into unsafe labor. Climate insecurity can strain household relationships and increase tensions, particularly where women lack protection mechanisms. Political and decision-making exclusion. Although women and gender-diverse individuals are disproportionately affected by climate change, they are often underrepresented in climate decision-making at all levels. Women's exclusion from land rights and governance bodies limits their ability to influence adaptation strategies. Lack of representation in climate negotiations and environmental planning leads to policies that fail to address their specific needs or knowledge. In some cases, women's climate knowledge is dismissed as non-scientific, despite its local relevance and effectiveness. Intersectionality and compounding inequities. The impact of climate change is intensified when gender intersects with other forms of marginalization, such as race and ethnicity, disability, age, sexual orientation, and gender identity, indigenous or migrant status. For instance, an elderly indigenous woman may face multiple barriers, cultural, economic, and health-related, in accessing climate support or participating in community planning. Conclusion. The impacts of climate change are deeply gendered, shaped by existing inequalities that leave women and marginalized groups more vulnerable. However, these groups also possess unique knowledge, resilience, and leadership potential that must be recognized and supported. By understanding these differentiated impacts, we can build more inclusive and equitable climate responses that leave no one behind. Part 6: Gender-Responsive Climate Action. Introduction. Gender-responsive climate action recognizes the unique needs, contributions, and rights of individuals of all genders, and ensures that climate strategies are inclusive, equitable, and effective. Rather than treating gender as an afterthought, It positions gender equity at the heart of climate planning, implementation and evaluation. This part explores the principles, practices and pathways for designing and executing gender-responsive climate initiatives. What is gender-responsive climate action? Gender-responsive climate action goes beyond gender-neutral policies by actively addressing gender inequalities. It analyzes how climate change and climate actions affect different genders differently, promotes equal participation and leadership of women and marginalized genders, ensures equitable access to resources, services and benefits from climate programs, seeks to transform existing power relations and eliminate structural barriers to equality. Principles of gender-responsive climate action. Inclusivity, engaging all genders in the design and implementation of climate actions. Participation, ensuring full and equal involvement in decision-making processes. Equity, providing targeted support to those disproportionately affected by climate impacts. Empowerment, building skills, knowledge and confidence among underrepresented groups. Accountability, setting measurable gender goals and tracking progress with gender-sensitive indicators. Integrating gender into climate adaptation. Adaptation strategies must be context-specific and inclusive of those most vulnerable. Gender-responsive adaptation includes community-based approaches that involve women and marginalized groups in identifying local risks and solutions. Climate-resilient agriculture programs that support women farmers with access to tools, training, and land rights. Water management initiatives that recognize women's roles and ease their workload through technology and infrastructure improvements. Disaster risk reduction (DRR) programs that address women's and girls' safety, mobility, and communication needs. Integrating gender into climate mitigation. Though often more technology-driven, mitigation efforts can and should be gender-sensitive. Examples include sustainable energy programs that promote women's access to clean cookstoves, solar panels, and energy entrepreneurship opportunities. Green jobs and training programs that ensure women and girls benefit from emerging climate-smart industries, e.g., solar installation, building retrofits. Transportation planning that considers gendered travel patterns, safety concerns, and accessibility. Carbon markets and finance initiatives that provide support to women-led projects or ensure equitable benefit sharing. Case studies of gender-responsive action. Nepal, women-led adaptation planning. In Nepal, women's groups have led local climate adaptation planning through the Local Adaptation Plans of Action (LAPAs). These plans incorporate traditional knowledge, address local priorities, and have improved community resilience. Kenya, gender and renewable energy. Kenya's Clean Energy for Women and Girls initiative focuses on improving access to solar lighting and clean cookstoves in rural communities. It also trains women as energy entrepreneurs, boosting income and autonomy. Peru, women in forest conservation. In Peru, indigenous women participate in forest monitoring and REDD+, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation programs, contributing to both carbon sequestration and biodiversity conservation. Tools and strategies for implementation. Gender analysis frameworks to understand needs and risks across groups. Gender budgeting to allocate financial resources fairly and strategically. Capacity building workshops for local government, NGOs and communities. Monitoring and evaluation systems with gender-sensitive indicators and feedback loops. Partnerships with women's organizations and grassroots movements. Role of governments, NGOs and the private sector. Governments must embed gender considerations into national climate policies, budget allocations and institutional structures. NGOs can offer critical grassroots insights, implement inclusive programs and advocate for gender justice in climate forums. Private sector actors have the potential to foster inclusive innovation, provide green jobs for women, and design climate solutions that are accessible and equitable. Financing gender-responsive climate action. Climate finance must be gender-responsive by prioritizing funding for women-led initiatives and organizations, ensuring access to climate funds for marginalized groups, requiring gender action plans in proposals to institutions like the Green Climate Fund, GCF, and Global Environment Facility, GEF. Tracking spending and outcomes using gender-sensitive indicators. Conclusion. Gender-responsive climate action is not just a matter of fairness, it is essential to effective, sustainable, and resilient climate solutions. By embedding gender at every level of climate response, we harness a wider range of knowledge, build stronger communities, and address the root causes of both climate vulnerability and gender inequality. In the next part, we will turn our focus to how gender equality and women's empowerment can drive more transformative climate leadership and innovation. Part 7. Empowering Women in Climate Leadership. Introduction. Climate leadership is about envisioning and executing solutions to the most pressing environmental crisis of our time. Yet, leadership spaces, political, scientific, business, and grassroots, have long been dominated by men. Empowering women in climate leadership is both a matter of justice and a strategic imperative. This part explores the importance of women's leadership in climate action, barriers they face, success stories from around the world, and pathways for inclusive leadership. Why women's leadership matters in climate action. Women bring distinct perspectives, knowledge systems, and leadership styles that enrich climate decision-making and implementation. When women lead, community resilience improves, especially in areas like disaster preparedness and resource management. Policies are more inclusive and reflective of diverse needs. Climate finance and adaptation efforts are often more efficient and equitable. Environmental outcomes are strengthened due to collaborative, long-term, and sustainability-focused approaches. Barriers to women's climate leadership. Despite their potential, women often face multiple structural and social barriers to participating in and leading climate initiatives. Cultural and social norms that restrict women's public roles. Limited access to education, training, and information in environmental and technical fields. Lack of financial resources and support for women-led initiatives. Underrepresentation in political offices and negotiation bodies at all levels. Gender biases in institutions and decision-making processes. Women leaders in climate action, global examples. Cristiana Figueres, Costa Rica. As Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC from 2010 to 2016, Figueres played a critical role in the success of the Paris Agreement. Her leadership style emphasized diplomacy, inclusivity, and optimism. Hindu Umaru Ibrahim, Chad. An indigenous leader advocating for climate justice, she bridges traditional knowledge and scientific understanding. She's also a key voice for marginalized communities at global climate forums. Vandana Shiva, India. A scientist and environmental activist, Shiva has championed agroecology, seed sovereignty, and sustainable farming, emphasizing the vital role of rural women in protecting biodiversity. Wangari Maathai, Kenya. The late Nobel laureate founded the Green Belt movement, mobilizing thousands of women to plant trees and advocate for environmental justice and women's rights. Local and grassroots women's leadership. While global leaders are important, grassroots women are the unsung heroes of climate resilience. In Bangladesh, women lead community-based flood early warning systems. In Uganda, women's cooperatives are transforming waste into clean energy. In Guatemala, indigenous women manage reforestation projects and biodiversity conservation. These women often lack formal recognition, but are making measurable impacts in their communities and ecosystems. Building women's leadership in climate fields. To empower more women as climate leaders, we must invest in education and training in environmental sciences, renewable energy and sustainable development, leadership programs and mentorship networks for girls and women, policy reforms that support work-life balance, equal pay and anti-discrimination, platforms for participation, including quotas or targets for representation in climate negotiations, boards and committees, creating enabling environments for women's leadership. Governments, institutions, and civil society must work together to create supportive environments for women to thrive in leadership roles. Key actions include institutional gender audits in climate bodies and ministries, gender-sensitive governance frameworks that promote transparency and accountability, capacity building that targets both women and male allies to shift norms and practices, visibility and recognition of women's contributions to encourage role modeling, the role of men and allies. Empowering women does not mean disempowering men, it means creating inclusive spaces where everyone contributes. Male allies play a vital role by challenging gender stereotypes, sharing leadership roles, supporting women's participation, and amplifying their voices, advocating for inclusive policy and institutional reform, measuring success in women's leadership. To assess progress, we need data-driven tools including gender disaggregated data on leadership in climate organizations, benchmarks for women's participation in policy development and implementation, impact assessments that link women's leadership with community resilience and climate outcomes. Conclusion: women's leadership is indispensable for effective and just climate action. From grassroots movements to global negotiations, women are already leading the way, but more must be done to break systemic barriers and unlock their full potential. The climate crisis demands inclusive, compassionate, and innovative leadership, and empowering women is a powerful step toward that future. Part 8: Climate Finance and Gender Equality. Introduction. Climate finance, the flow of funds to support climate mitigation and adaptation, has emerged as a central pillar of global climate governance. Yet, without deliberate efforts, these financial mechanisms can reinforce existing inequalities. Gender-responsive climate finance ensures that women and marginalized groups can access, influence and benefit from climate investments. This part examines the intersection of gender and finance, explores challenges in current systems, and identifies strategies to make climate finance more equitable and effective. What is climate finance? Climate finance refers to the local, national, or international financing drawn from public, private, and alternative sources that supports climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts. Major sources include multilateral funds, e.g., Green Climate Fund, Global Environment Facility; bilateral aid, e.g., Climate-Focused Development Assistance; private sector investment, e.g., green bonds, sustainable infrastructure; philanthropic and civil society funding. Why gender matters in climate finance. Climate impacts and responses are gendered. If finance mechanisms are blind to gender, women and marginalized communities may be excluded from accessing funds. Projects may ignore local knowledge and needs. Resources may disproportionately benefit those already in power. Gender-responsive finance aims to promote inclusivity in decision-making, target resources toward the most vulnerable, enhance project effectiveness through community-driven solutions. Barriers to gender-responsive climate finance. Limited access to funding. Women's organizations and community groups often lack formal recognition. Financial literacy. Capacity to meet complex donor requirements. Gender-neutral design. Many funding proposals and climate programs are gender-blind, failing to assess how projects affect men and women differently or to set gender-specific goals. Inadequate data and metrics. Without sex-disaggregated data and gender indicators, it's difficult to measure equity in climate finance. Institutional bias. Finance and climate institutions are often male-dominated, with limited understanding of gender equity or inclusion. The Green Climate Fund (GCF), a gender milestone. The Green Climate Fund is the largest multilateral climate fund and a global leader in gender integration. Key features. Requires all project proposals to include a gender assessment and action plan. Supports capacity building for gender mainstreaming. Tracks gender outcomes in monitoring and evaluation. However, despite progress, access for grassroots women's organizations remains limited. Gender and climate budgeting. Climate-responsive budgeting involves integrating climate and gender perspectives into national budget processes. Key practices include allocating budget lines specifically for gender-responsive climate action, tracking expenditure on women's empowerment and climate resilience, auditing public finance systems to identify gender disparities. Examples: Mexico has developed tools for tracking both gender and climate expenditures. Nepal introduced gender and climate budget codes to improve transparency and targeting. Financing women-led climate solutions. Supporting women-led solutions can significantly enhance climate outcomes. Mechanisms include microfinance and credit access for women entrepreneurs in clean energy, agroecology, or water management. Community grant programs targeting women's cooperatives. Blended finance models that reduce risks for private investors in gender-equitable projects. Success story. In Senegal, a solar energy initiative provided financing and training for women to manage mini-grids, improving energy access and income in remote areas. Role of private sector and philanthropy. Private investors and philanthropic foundations can drive gender-responsive innovation by incorporating gender criteria in investment decisions, funding gender-specific research and pilot projects, supporting impact investing focused on climate and gender outcomes. Some emerging tools: gender bonds for climate-smart infrastructure, environmental, social, and governance (ESG) frameworks that prioritize gender equality toward equitable finance systems. Key strategies for building gender-responsive climate finance systems include capacity development for women and local organizations in proposal writing and fund management, simplifying funding processes to be accessible for community-based organizations, mandatory gender mainstreaming in all public and private climate finance instruments, robust monitoring frameworks that track gender impacts and outcomes, participatory governance to ensure diverse voices guide funding priorities. Conclusion: equity in climate finance is not a luxury, it is a necessity for sustainable, effective, and just climate action. By removing financial barriers and empowering women-led and gender-inclusive solutions, we can drive transformative change in both environmental and social systems. The next part will explore tools and methodologies for integrating gender into climate project design and policy planning. Part 9: Tools and methodologies for gender integration in climate planning. Introduction. Integrating gender into climate planning is not a matter of good intentions alone. It requires concrete tools, methodologies, and frameworks. Effective gender integration ensures that climate policies, programs, and projects recognize gender differences, respond to gender-specific needs, and empower underrepresented groups. This part presents key tools and approaches used by practitioners, governments, and organizations to mainstream gender in climate planning and decision-making processes. Gender analysis. Gender analysis is the foundation of gender-responsive climate planning. It helps identify how different genders are affected by climate change, what roles they play, and what resources they control. Key components: roles and responsibilities, access to and control over resources, decision-making power, needs, constraints, and opportunities. Tools: Harvard Analytical Framework, Moser Gender Planning Framework, UNDP's Gender Analysis Matrix. Application: a gender analysis might reveal that women in a farming community have limited access to irrigation tools, prompting project designers to address this gap. Gender Impact Assessment (GIA). GIA is used to evaluate the potential gender-specific outcomes of a policy, program or project, both positive and negative. Steps: identify affected groups, assess differential impacts, propose mitigation and enhancement measures, include indicators to monitor impacts. Use case: a climate resilience infrastructure project may be assessed to ensure it doesn't disproportionately burden women or exclude their participation. Gender-sensitive indicators. Monitoring and evaluating gender outcomes requires gender-sensitive indicators, which provide data disaggregated by sex and gender identity. Examples: % of women participating in climate-related consultations, % of climate funding reaching women-led initiatives, % of women trained in clean energy technologies, % change in time spent by women on water collection. These indicators help track progress, adjust programs, and ensure accountability. Gender Action Plans gaps. A gender action plan is a strategic document that outlines how gender equality will be promoted in a specific climate initiative. Components: objectives and activities, responsible parties, timelines, budget allocations, monitoring mechanisms. Example: the Green Climate Fund requires all project proposals to include a gender action plan to ensure inclusive design and implementation. Gender budgeting tools. Gender responsive budgeting (GRB) integrates gender considerations into fiscal policy and resource allocation. Key techniques: gender expenditure audits, gender budget statements, cost-benefit analysis from a gender perspective. Benefits: promotes transparency, enhances equity in resource allocation, supports targeted interventions. Countries like Rwanda, India and Austria have adopted GRB in climate-related sectors. Stakeholder mapping and participation tools. Inclusive planning relies on stakeholder mapping and participatory tools to ensure diverse representation. Approaches: participatory rural appraisal (PRA), focus group discussions segregated by gender, power and influence mapping. These tools help identify key actors, power dynamics and communication pathways to ensure all voices, especially those of women and marginalized genders, are heard. Climate risk and vulnerability assessments (CRVAs) with gender lens. Adding a gender lens to CRVAs helps planners understand how vulnerabilities differ across gender groups. Application: mapping how men and women are differently affected by droughts, floods, or sea level rise. Identifying coping strategies employed by different groups. Designing interventions that target those most at risk. Gender mainstreaming checklists and toolkits. Several organizations offer checklists and toolkits that support systematic gender integration. Examples: UN Women's Climate Smart Gender Action Toolkit, FAO's Gender in Climate Smart Agriculture Sourcebook, OECD's Toolkit for Mainstreaming Gender Equality in Development Cooperation. These resources offer step-by-step guidance, templates, and examples that can be adapted to local context. Building institutional capacity. Tools are most effective when supported by Training and awareness programs for planners and policymakers. Dedicated gender focal points in climate institutions. Institutional gender policies, with clear mandates and accountability structures. Regular evaluation and adaptive learning mechanisms are also essential for continuous improvement. Conclusion: integrating gender into climate planning is both a technical and political process. The tools and methodologies presented in this part offer practical pathways to create inclusive, equitable, and effective climate responses. When gender perspectives are embedded from the outset, climate planning becomes more responsive, locally grounded, and transformative. The final part will synthesize the key messages of this course and outline a vision for a gender-just climate future. Part 10: Toward a Gender-Just Climate Future. Introduction. As the impacts of climate change grow more intense and widespread, so does the urgency to build a more just, inclusive, and sustainable future. A gender-just climate future envisions a world where all people, regardless of gender, are equally empowered to shape climate solutions, enjoy their benefits, and thrive in a rapidly changing environment. This final part outlines the core principles, transformative pathways, and collective commitments needed to make this vision a reality. Defining a gender-just climate future. A gender-just climate future is one where gender equality is central to climate policy and practice. Women and marginalized genders have equal power, voice, and leadership in climate action. Climate responses address the root causes of inequality and environmental degradation. Development is inclusive, sustainable, and equitable for all communities. This future is not only about adapting to climate change, it's about transforming societies. Lessons from the journey. Over the course of this program, we've explored the disproportionate impact of climate change on women and marginalized groups, the importance of mainstreaming gender across climate sectors, the power of women's leadership in creating sustainable change, the gaps in climate finance and planning that must be addressed, the tools and methods available for creating inclusive climate policies. Together, these insights provide a roadmap for moving from awareness to action. Transformational levers for change. 1. Political will and policy reform. Governments must commit to embedding gender equality in climate legislation, frameworks, and institutions at all levels. This includes gender-responsive climate laws and action plans, inclusion of gender indicators in national climate monitoring, representation quotas in decision-making bodies. 2. Inclusive governance. A just future demands inclusive and participatory governance that values community knowledge and lived experience, engages women and other underrepresented groups in planning and implementation, builds trust through transparency and accountability. 3. Equitable climate finance. Climate finance mechanisms must ensure direct access for women-led organizations and grassroots groups, require gender assessments and action plans in all projects, monitor financial flows and outcomes using sex-disaggregated data. 4. Education and capacity building. Education is a catalyst for gender equity in climate action. Priorities include climate and gender curricula in schools and universities, training programs for women in science, technology, and leadership, public awareness campaigns to shift harmful norms. 5. Intersectional approaches. True justice requires attention to intersectionality, how gender interacts with race, class, age, disability, geography, and more. Policies must be sensitive to multiple layers of discrimination, promote tailored solutions that meet diverse needs, avoid one-size-fits-all strategies. The role of youth and future generations. Youth, particularly young women and girls, are already leading climate justice movements across the globe. A gender-just future must nurture the leadership of young people, create intergenerational platforms for climate dialogue, invest in innovation driven by youth and marginalized voices, global solidarity and collective action. Climate change knows no borders, and neither should justice. A gender-just climate future requires international cooperation to ensure equity in climate negotiations and resource distribution, solidarity movements that connect gender, environmental and human rights struggles, shared responsibility from the global North to support just transitions in the global South, hope, resilience and possibility. Despite the challenges, stories throughout this course have shown that change is not only possible, it is already happening. Women are leading reforestation efforts, transforming energy systems and driving inclusive policies. Communities are organizing for resilience. Allies are building bridges across movements. A gender-just future is not a distant ideal. It is a path we build every day, through advocacy, action, courage and collaboration. Conclusion: call to action. As we conclude, let this be a call to governments to lead with justice and inclusion, organizations to mainstream gender in every climate action, communities to uplift local leadership and traditional knowledge, individuals to challenge norms, listen deeply and act boldly. Climate change is the defining challenge of our time, but it is also an opportunity. An opportunity to rebuild our societies on the foundations of equity, dignity and sustainability. By centering gender justice, we move closer to a world where all people can live with safety, opportunity and hope in the face of a changing climate.